Doesn't like tell you right away. Hi guys, this is Nicole Van Tassel with I Explore Science, and I'm here with Dr. Alexis Patterson-Williams, a lot of names, Patterson-Williams, and Dr. Salina Gray. And they were here like last month, and we talked about their holistic science pedagogy, but this time we're going to be focusing on one aspect of their holistic science pedagogy, which is all about using science as a transformative agent and bringing in like social justice issues and all of that. So, and how we can tie that with the NGSS is in relation to our phenomena. So real quick introduction to phenomena, and then these ladies will kind of take the lead here. But your phenomena with the NGSS, we're not just checking off standards, we're not just checking off content, we're investigating phenomena. Our students are investigating phenomena, investigating real things that happen in the real world. And that's something that's just standard across, go anywhere and learn about the NGSS, and that's what you see. But beyond just investigating any real world phenomena, we really want our students to be investigating phenomena that is relevant to them, because that's what's going to like get past their little brain sensors that focus on the things they care about and actually tune into your science content, because it's going to register, oh wait, I should care about this, or I do care about this. So when you are bringing in social justice issues that are of relevance to your students, that adds that emotional connection, and it adds, again, that relevance that is going to make everything that follows in your unit. So if your social justice issue, like Flint, Michigan water crisis, which is what Salina is going to be talking about, when that ties your whole unit together, when that's your anchor phenomenon, and everything else that follows, when you can tie it back to that anchor, it just adds that relevance for like, why should we learn this? Oh yeah, it has that real world human connection and application and I don't know, relevance. I said relevance a lot. Anyway, so I am going to let Dr. Williams and Dr. Gray introduce themselves and give a quick summary of their WSP, their Holistic Science Pedagogy Framework. You can always check out the last video that they did to get a much like bigger picture of it. You can also read the paper that was posted in the group. But then we'll dive into Salina's lesson about the Flint, Michigan water crisis and this idea of using social justice as your phenomena. And please, I'm going to be keeping an eye on the comments on my laptop over here, so please ask questions throughout and we will just be addressing them. And we plan to be here for the next 45 minutes or so I'm glad that you guys are here with us. All right, so you guys can go ahead and introduce yourself. I don't know if you want to go first, Alexis.
Yep, I'll go ahead. Good morning if you are on the West Coast, or afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Alexis Patterson-Williams. I'm happy to be back again. I'm an assistant professor at UC Davis in the School of Education and study science education. Prior to my kind of academic career, I worked in Oakland Unified School District for 8 years as an assistant director of after-school programming, also as a middle school science teacher teaching 7th and 8th graders. Then I've also worked with the little folks in elementary school, supporting 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade as an intervention instructor as well. And since we're keeping it brief, I will stop there and turn it over to Salina.
Hey everyone, Salina Gray, 23 years in public education. That includes traditional, public, and charter. I've taught grades 3 through graduate school, content specifically, chemistry, high school environmental science, middle school life and physical. So I've taught all the babies at various levels of their development and growth. I'm also a certified yoga instructor and a wellness, you could say a wellness coach. And I'm very glad to be here.
Awesome. Okay, so I gave an introduction of anchor phenomena and all of that. So I would love, Salina, if you could tell us a little bit about your like overall, like what was your Flint, Michigan lesson about? What was the content you were targeting? And then we can dive into, you know, the details of how you actually went about doing it.
Right. Okay. So as Nicole mentioned, it's not enough to just pick, you know, phenomenon, right? You want phenomena that are engaging. Even better if it's something that the students can relate to, that they have some experience of, some knowledge of in some way. And that's one of the beautiful things about science. As I tell my students, you were born scientists because you ask questions, you were constantly trying to figure out how things work, you're taking things apart. And so it was the same thing. This is what I bring into the classroom. And so just looking for doing our unit on matter, right? Part of that was chemical equations. And I thought, wow, what can I do to really get kids to understand the importance of understanding molecules and compounds and equations and balancing equations and the law of conservation of mass, right? And so I thought, Flint, something I was sure that my students had heard something, even if they weren't intimately familiar with the details. It's something that's prevalent enough in the news over the last few years that students may have known something about it. And if not, they knew about water because we've talked about water. They drink water, they bathe, they shower. So I thought, okay, bringing these two things together would be a nice way to get them involved. And so that's what started it. And so the lesson was really about, and it would also bring in the social justice piece because in our classroom, we abide by the commitments, and part of one of the commitments is using and seeing science as a transformative agent. And so that means acknowledging that there's some transformation that's been very helpful and useful, but also looking at some of the ways that science has been misused and abused and not used in very ethical ways. And so that was the start. That's what prompted the development of this Flint lesson, Flint activity. It also incorporated language arts components because students had to write, they had to collaborate in small groups. And their task was to really recreate the story of Flint based on a bunch of data that we gave them. And the data was in the form of social media snippets from Twitter and Facebook that were compiled, and they had to go through and create this chronology of Flint and work with their group to basically make sense and explain what happened in Flint.
Neat. Okay, so I want to highlight a couple things. Like first, this was chemistry. So a lot of times I hear from chemistry teachers, there's like this big struggle. And I know it was middle school, right?
Right.
So I know with chemistry in high school, a lot of times it goes beyond the NGSS standards because the NGSS is your baseline and chemistry can be an advanced course. But even for like the baseline, a lot of chemistry teachers struggle with like, how do I find the phenomena? How do I make it relevant? So I want to highlight, like you did this with a chemistry unit. So it is possible to find those connections. I know like the ozone layer is another connection just offhand that I remember learning about in environmental science. And it was like, oh yeah, that's why chemistry is important. And then also like your students might not have had personal connection to Flint or might not have, like they weren't poisoned there themselves. And a lot of times when we think of like phenomena, yes, we want things that our students have directly experienced or can experience in the classroom at the investigative level, like bringing in that hands-on component or, where they can relate to, oh yeah, I saw that outside the other day. But when we're talking about your big anchor phenomena, there's nothing wrong with going to something that they haven't personally experienced, but they could still relate with. Like there's still that emotional connection when you hear about, a young child getting like lead poisoning and, having those impacts, like whether you live in Flint or not, you're going to be impacted by that. Or you can connect to, oh, I have a baby sister and she was sick and I would be so sad if my baby sister was made sick from this other, you know what I mean? So it doesn't always have to be like a direct connection. So I just want to highlight those two things.
Absolutely.
And it was funny, you said that it was tied to an English language arts thing because somebody who was a Kelsey, I think she just posted like they do a documentary on social justice in their English language arts class. So she's looking forward to combining. So that's also like an awesome way to get or interdisciplinary like connections.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then with that also, Alexis can speak to this part, we took, and mind you, this is all before, the way we used it, this idea of anchoring, and we call it our anchoring phenomenon because it's how we begin. And for the rest of the week, for the weeks that we're going through these lessons that maybe we don't mention Flint, it ties back to Flint because we'll say like, remember when we talked about you know, what's the symbol for lead? And that makes them think of the periodic table, and they end up thinking about molecules, and then we can write chemical equations. And so you don't, that's the beauty, I think, of NGSS and this idea of the anchoring phenomenon. It kind of holds you there. So no matter where you go, no matter how far you go, right? And when kids start sharing we go places, that anchoring holds us down and keeps us together. And so Alexis, could you talk a little bit about the restorative justice aspect? Because we also did a really, I think, solid job bringing in the social emotional, which is another commitment, and the restorative commitment, with the kind of questions, the reflection questions and discussion that we had. Alexis, could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so when we designed this lesson, you know, we really were aiming to give the students a really well-rounded experience, and we wanted them to engage with the science content, as well as, you know, thinking about, one, I think it's important to think about how the people involved in the Flint, Michigan kind of uncovering of lead poisoning, how they use science in a transformative way. So it wasn't the government officials who rolled out this information and then the people actually had to use their science knowledge to like make sense of, but it actually ended up being that, you know, medical folks, you know, lay people in the community were using their knowledge, their observation skills, their inferences, their own medical knowledge to make sense of, you know, lead tests, and using information, doctors were using information from children that they were seeing to really uncover and to hold the government officials accountable. So that was another way that we really wanted our students to see that science is meaningful. Even if you don't go into being a scientist, having this knowledge and being able to make sense of what's going on around you is something that science provides a lens for. So that was one of the ways that we really thought that Flint highlighted how science can be transformative, whether you're working in a science industry or not, and that the community members can come together to work to make science useful and bring about justice. And so one of the things that we wanted to do in this lesson is really give students an opportunity to grapple with the ethics of, you know, the situation and what happened, and really humanize the experience. Because even as we kind of talked about earlier, you know, we're not from Michigan. We were in California. This took place in the Southern California context. So we really did want to humanize the data, make this experience something that they can think about and carry with them in their lives. And so we had a set of questions, and for those folks who may not be familiar with restorative practices or restorative justice, one of the things that is at the center of that is really thinking about the harm that has been done, and thinking about how we can repair harm and restore any breaks in the community or in the relationship. And so that was really the center and the grounding point of these questions after they looked at these different social media posts and had a chance to do some kind of investigative journaling of their own and put together the story of Flint, and watch videos to see how their understanding of what happened in Flint compared to what was outlined in the media. We really wanted to give them these questions that would allow them to do some critical reflection of the entire story. And these questions consisted of, you know, who was harmed and what was the harm done and what was the cause of the harm, and then who's responsible for creating this harm. I mean, one of the questions that has really been powerful, and I was actually able to observe in Salina's class when she taught this lesson to the students, was really thinking about, you know, could this harm be undone, or how might we repair the harm, and what would justice look like for those who would be harmed? And I think the trickier question was, can there be justice? And there was just a range of emotions from the students as they began to understand, you know, what this harm looked like, from, you know, babies to children to adults, and what those ramifications were in terms of physical health education, how physical health impacted students' abilities to learn, right? And that some of these harms were, you know, lifetime harms, that, you know, lifetime medical impacts. And so really giving students the opportunity to grapple with that, to grapple with what that means. And one of my favorite, you know, points that Salina brought up in that discussion was to think about how did the politicians get to the place that folks were disposable, or that their reputations or their careers were so important that covering up what was going on took precedent over the health and the well-being of students, and that you don't get to that place overnight. And so what does that mean in terms of our ethics, the decisions that we make today, and not just sitting in judgment of people and the decisions that they make, you know, down the road. And so it led to a really robust conversation as a means to really think through, you know, what happened and what the science was able to uncover, but also like what it means.
I like love the focus on, I mean, really you're kind of like teaching like empathy, or like having them think about, or like kind of fostering, I don't know if you can like teach empathy exactly, but like fostering like that like empathetic response and empathy. And I think we can probably all agree, like the world needs a little bit more empathy today. So like I love like that tie-in as well. And I think that is just like like valuable across the board, and how you can bring that in like to the science class. You're still learning your science content, and you're still like connecting, like, I mean, it's still adding to your science curriculum and all of that, because making that emotional connection is going to help the longer lasting learning and all of that. But you're bringing in some of those other, you know, focuses or whatever. And I mean, we've talked about before, seeing yourself as like a scientist versus like not a scientist or whatever. You have community people who are engaged in basically doing science by making these connections, whether they are labeled scientists, you know, outside in their jobs or not. Like there's all of those aspects. Oh, and then Salina mentioned one thing, and I just wanted to highlight. Salina, you mentioned like your anchor is like grounding you, and you might not talk about it every single day. And a complaint I hear a lot from teachers is like, well, my students got bored with the anchor, you know, by the end of the unit, and or they got sick of talking about it or whatever. And I think that is important to realize, like, you don't have to talk about it every single day. It might just be like a quick, oh yeah, remember when it came up? Or, so it's not like it's this thing that you, every single class you're talking about your anchor or applying what you learned to it. It's just, you're tying it back periodically. So I'm glad that you pointed that out.
Absolutely.
So
what happens, I'm sorry, to add to that, one of the things that happens is the kids bring it up. And that's what you want. You want the kids to say, oh my gosh, this relates. And so the kids contribute to the story that's developing around the anchor. That's
true. So that's the goal. That is, yes.
For them to bring it back.
Yeah. Yes, that is so true. So Kelly mentioned that, hi Kelly also, she mentioned that they look at the clean water crisis in Africa, because she has a student that has a former student that has her own school there. But also helping students realize that there's a water crisis here in the United States. And so they also talk about Flint, and I don't know what else. But anyway, so she commented that, so I thought that was neat. So you can even tie together like these things that are happening, you know, like here's Flint, but also look at these other examples. And that's actually an awesome way to do that, like practice. Like after you've investigated Flint, you could then go look at another phenomena, like a pollution example in another country or another community or somewhere else, and bring that in, and like, how is it different? How is it similar?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Can you tell us more about the social media data analysis thing that you did?
I can actually show you one. So what we have, and shout out to the Stanford Teacher Education Program teacher who was in the program when I worked there. And he had developed this lesson around Flint, and I loved it so much, and asked if I could do something around it and just kind of see what Alexis and I could add and contribute. And so we want to shout him out. Because he made these beautiful cards. So I don't know if you all can see it, but it's a card, and each group gets a
little
number.
closer, Salina.
Better? Can you all see them?
Yeah. I mean,
Ish. Yeah. Get it. That's what I'm about to say. Don't get
But
it.
basically, you see, it's called it's a combination of like Twitter and Facebook, and it's just their posts. So they have a date, they have an image, and then they have text. And so students, we didn't give them any specifics on how to order them, but they get like 3 rounds, and each round they get 6 cards, and they read through the data. We say that it's data, and each round they get more data to add, and so their story, their explanation evolves over time.
Yeah.
And so part of the lesson there is what we think we know shifts constantly as we get more data.
And so Holly mentioned, like, this is so relevant right now with COVID. What you just said is so relevant right now with COVID.
Yes. I was thinking that.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's the nature of science. And you see how many, the level of science illiteracy in this nation, because people are angry because they're like, the story keeps changing.
Yes. You know what? I feel like
Science.
your activity right here is so much better than any other, like, let's introduce the scientific method. You know, those activities everybody does at the beginning of the year to introduce what science is about.
Very linear.
And it shows it's linear, and you just get the one answer at the end, and then we're done. And okay, we're done with science. but doing something like what you have here, where it's this mystery that kind of evolves over time, and it's engaging, and the ideas just change over time. Like, that activity alone would be such a better introduction, and I don't think the grammar is right there, but like a way better introduction to like what science is than probably all of those.
Well, and then the other thing is that those cards, they were from different sources and sites. So then also weaving into that is some of the government agencies that have contradictory information, and they're weaving that in, right? So there's evidence from people's personal Twitter accounts, evidence from certain government agencies in Flint that are saying everything is fine.
Yeah.
And also, and they, there's no particular order in which they get them. So they're having
those cards, did they have things like, and I could see if you didn't, like I could see also you could incorporate, like, did they have things like actual like graphs or like numbers and things like that students could analyze as well?
Kind of data, because what we want them to learn is that we teach there's quantitative and there's qualitative data. And we don't want to privilege one over the other. Context matters, but the more data, the more types. So yes, some are just images. Some have specific numbers. They all have a visual. Some have maps, one has a map of Michigan. One actually has a bacterium. So we have it's literally all kinds.
That's all, so then they can see the range of data, that it's not just graphs. I mean, the graphs are good and things, but there's other types of data too, ways of understanding.
And it's so wonderful to hear how they grapple and they debate over what something means. And then they'll say, no, but 32 weeks ago, the governor said this. So it's just to hear the conversations that students have. And then sometimes they'll go and say, Dr. Gray, can I go look up something?
Yeah.
Can I go look up something real quick? And so it becomes, it's a really powerful tool that can be used in many ways. You give them data, you have them wrestle and make sense of it, which is what we want. That is so crucial to the scientific process.
There is this quote on Instagram, like a couple weeks ago when Hamilton was first released, and it was like, how you spent 3 hours Googling about Hamilton last night while you watched, and it was like, that's like culturally responsive teaching. That's like responsive. And that is exactly what, we're exploring all of this stuff, and oh wait, I have these questions, I want to go investigate. Like, that's literally what education we want our classroom to be about. So I love that. Jessica asked if those activity cards are available anywhere, or if they are able to be shared. I don't know.
I think we have shared them in
the paper. I don't know.
I think there's a link in the paper. Is that right, Salina?
I don't remember, but if not, we can share them. You have to print them out, obviously, but we have the images.
Digital or whatever.
We have them in a Google Doc,
And so I would encourage you, like, if there's an issue or something out, to start collecting, screenshotting things and put them in your file, because they may come in handy. Especially with COVID. especially
Oh
around
yeah, you
COVID.
could take so much. And then Kelly asked, do you so Deb, yeah, that answers your question too. And then Kelly asked, do you ever use infographics as well? Or have you used infographics with any of these things?
Alexis, our latest, we actually just developed another lesson that's going to be coming out. Did we use infographics? I feel like it was,
I was racking my brain trying to figure out if there were, we just put together another lesson that's coming out in NSTA, actually, the science teacher. It was just accepted, so we don't know how long it's going to take for it to come out, but that will be coming out soon. And we went through so many pieces of data for that I know.
That one's on climate change, right? Global warming and climate change. Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to say that I think in the long run we ended up taking the infographic out, but I think if we when we use it in the classroom, we probably would use more data in it than what we were able to include in the actual written piece. And you know, that's another point. There were some great media clips that we found, and that's also something that we wove into the Flint lesson, because it's really important to have multiple entry points for students to be able to access and make sense of the data. And so I want to say that there was an actual infographic that was turned into a video that we looked at and considered for that climate change lesson, and we wanted to.
Okay, so that was pretty, like, that entry activity, I feel like that was like your introduction, your kind of engagement, you know, here's the phenomena that we're going to be investigating in this unit. So what did the rest, and we only sticking to our timeline, we have about 15 minutes, so like, but what did the rest of your unit look like? Like, how were you still able to like get into, you know, the like content stuff?
Right.
same old content stuff.
Well, again, prior to that, we had, remember this comes in sort of the middle of a unit or between two units. So students had already done, you know, fundamentals of the periodic table, atoms, characteristics of elements. And so this built on that because what we really focused on was lead. And so from this, we talked about chemical reactions, right? Because we talked about chemical change, they talked about physical change. So this just kind of allowed us to go deeper into chemical change, what that meant, chemical reactions. And I just made sure lead came up a lot. And so we talked what the anchoring phenomenon does is, at least for my students, it makes them feel that they can go in and be successful, because this whole activity made them feel like they were chemists. And so they were very open to learning how to balance equations, how to write chemical equations. They were comfortable doing oxidation reduction, things that in previous years my kids would be like spooked, because we kept saying, remember that chemical reactions are what was happening in Flint. That's what was going on. Like, and so we continued on with sort of the standard traditional chemistry, you know, all the way up through for 8th grade, balancing equations. We went a little deeper, a little more complex, I think, than what was required, but it just allowed them to feel like, I'm a chemist. Of course I can do this. I need to make sense of this because this is what happened in Flint.
That's awesome. Yes. So it's not like when we do this phenomena, we are just getting rid of all of the regular stuff.
The phenomenon is like, when I taught elementary, it was this idea of activating prior knowledge. Yes. The phenomenon becomes their prior knowledge.
Nice. Okay. Awesome.
Like, what do you already know? Well, look, we're talking about the law of conservation of mass. Yeah. What do you think that means? This is partially why the lead, what do you think the lead is just going to disappear, evaporate? Right. No, because of why? So we constantly, that's how we used it.
And then, as you said, it created those new questions like, oh, I need to figure this out because I want to answer this question that ties to. Yeah. Exactly. Awesome.
And one thing I'll add is I was working with the Exploratorium and their teachers, and Salina and I have both taught this lesson in a lot of different contexts. So with middle schoolers, but also with teachers, teacher educators. And the folks at the Exploratorium, after I had done this lesson with their teachers, they ended up creating some of their own content-based lessons to complement the activity, to kind of take it further and give their teachers opportunities to think about ways to integrate the Flint lesson into different units that they were doing. And so they did some filtration activities, so thinking about filtering. So they had, soaked some pennies in water and measured the content of the copper, and then filtered out the water and try to think about, could we filter it out? And then how does that compare to lead? Like, how is copper similar to lead? How is it different? We talked about, but didn't do it, thinking about, the biochemical nature. So what does lead actually do to the body? And think about how we might explore that if we were doing, trying to take it that way. If we were doing maybe like an anatomy or a health science kind of class, to take it that way. So there are so many ways to integrate the content, ways to integrate this lesson into different units at different grade levels. It's not just a middle school lesson. It could really fit into a lot of different places.
Yeah, it really just adds that, like, why are we doing this soap and penny? In the past, it's like, okay, we're doing this because, but also why, like, I'm not going to put my pennies and I'm not going to like drink my pennies or something like that. I don't know. You know what I mean? But it adds like the why. So why are we doing this very contrived lab experiment, which sometimes you have to do in the classroom to replicate these, situations. Sometimes they are very contrived, and it adds that real world lens to it. What are some other, so with like, any other questions? Those of you who are watching, please post your questions. But like, what are some other maybe social justice issues that you could see? Because a lot of people just have trouble brainstorming phenomena. Like, you go to phenomena websites and there are a lot of examples, but sometimes you're just like, my students aren't going to connect to that. So like, do you have examples? I mean, I know we didn't plan this question. It just popped in my head. But do you have any other examples of like some social justice topics or issues or themes or examples or anything that, phenomena that might tie to some different content that would come up in our science classes?
Sure. So one, and it's still tied. I love water, obviously, and I like that one of the viewers mentioned water, and the students really get into water. So I've done a unit on women and children who walk with water, and that was sort of this anchoring phenomenon, right? Looking at nations where women and children have to walk for water, and out of that we talked about the students had their final project, so they learned all about water, the water cycle, et cetera, and then their final project, their engineering project, was to design a technology to support women and children who have to walk for water. Out of that, we did stuff around agriculture. So agriculture, stuff around food deserts. So I've done stuff around food deserts as a phenomenon. Of course, this was pre-NGSS, some of it, so I didn't know to call it a phenomenon. Now I realize those were phenomena. But I would start with showing them a picture of a completely, like, I think it was in Australia some years back. And it was just like dry, cracked earth where there was once, lush land. And so that became the phenomenon that led into like ecosystems and food webs and food chains. Those are a couple off the top. I do a lot with anatomy and physiology. So again, rather than just talking about nutrition, what did you eat and how did you eat? I talk about food deserts within communities. That becomes sort of the anchoring phenomenon that we want to explain. I've done stuff around fair trade chocolate when talking about agriculture and ecosystems. Actually, blood diamonds was an early one, earlier in my middle school, later in my elementary career, around blood diamonds. And so that was tied into talking about geology and earth science. And then of course, global warming and climate change.
Yeah, that's big.
So those are just a few that I can think of off the top.
Nice, those are some really good examples.
Well, and I think more than just, one of the things that the lesson hits on with the global warming and the climate change is the climate gap. And so thinking about your footprint is versus how much of the impact you're actually feeling and how that impact is felt differently globally as well as across different communities. And so that can go a lot of different ways in terms of, in terms of like weather and the weather impacts and, water rising and just all of the different ways. And that can hit across the different grade levels.
Oh, yeah.
So it can be really robust in the ways that we think about it.
Thank
Right.
you for sharing those. Okay, so we have just a little bit of time left. Again, if you have questions, someone said food deserts and food security. It's a good social justice issue for nutrition and macromolecules even. So like even like in a bio course, like a traditional bio course, even if you're not doing like nutrition or like body systems or something, it like macromolecules are important.
Absolutely.
For the, so kind of going back to the, shoot, what's the word? Where we reflect on when I mentioned empathy, but there was the other word for it and I'm spacing out on it, but where we reflect on like who did the harm and who and like can it be fixed and reparations and all of that. What are some ways that you, so beyond like just questioning, or like how do you, I don't know, engage your students in these discussions, or is there any tips that you can provide with like interacting with your students on these kind of topics? Any like, not like warnings, but like challenges with it and like how you might respond? Like I could imagine some students, I mean, just looking at adults, becoming defensive or becoming upset, or like, how do you navigate kind of those difficult conversations?
Right.
Any thoughts?
We could both speak on this all day, but I'll let Alexis go on this one.
I think one of the things is really trying to, one, just be open to where students go with it. I think a lot of times, and there's a great article that just came out about thinking about these conversations as difficult versus something that we are maybe unpracticed in. And when we say they're difficult, it cultivates our own anxiety. So it's an interesting change in language that I was just reading about, that I was like, yeah, I'm gonna start using it, that these are unpracticed conversations and that they can feel challenging for us. And so one of the things I think when we open up this can of worms, and it can feel like a can of worms, is really allowing the students to discuss it and not to feel like we have to come to the defense of certain perspectives, but really allowing students the opportunity to have a robust conversation. So that would be the first thing I'd say, is really just allowing to reduce our own anxiety and to kind of sit in whatever discomforts that might come up for us as students are having these conversations about harm that can really question and challenge what's going on. The other thing is, I think, really trying to not leave students feeling in despair or that things are hopeless. So really trying to, sorry, my voice is starting to go out, but really trying to give students hope. And so letting them know, like, what are the next steps? So really trying to cultivate agency in students, that there are some times that things are done that are problematic. And so, as mentioned earlier, not trying to demonize, but also trying to humanize, and really trying to help students see that any of us could make these decisions, and really trying to understand what are we going to do to safeguard and to make sure that we, don't develop those ways of being and doing. And then thinking about, when we find ourselves in these moments, what are the acts of agency that we can take as well within our own context and what's within our own locus of control. So those are just a few things that come to the top of mind for me. Salina, what are some thoughts?
Absolutely. No, I would agree. And which is why I would just encourage us all as we move into a new school year, that creating a space early on where with more low stakes sort of conversations where students
Yes.
feel comfortable taking risks by sharing their feelings and sharing what they think. So you don't want to just plop in, in March after having a classroom where you haven't had these types of conversations and this kind of, I like this unpracticed questioning, and say, well, today we're going to talk about trauma and harm, right? You want to lead up to that. And so I encourage being very conscious about the kind of space you want to create. So in our class, we have expectations, and they're expectations that govern how we interact with each other, how we have conversation, how we react when people say things. And the best indication, even though this is completely not related, the best indication I think of the kind of space that I create is that literally every single year that I've taught middle school, I'll say the last 6 years, I've had 1 to 2 students who use my classroom space in front of students to come out, and who will say, you know, everyone, I want you to know that I'm bisexual. You know, everyone, I want you to know I'm gay. And these are middle school students, right? 12 or 13-year-olds, but they know that, number one, they're in a space where they're not going to be judged, they're not going to be laughed at. Whatever people's personal opinions and biases do not matter. And so that's the kind of space you want to create, and you can do it because I taught, you know, students who were traditionally marginalized, historically marginalized students in underserved communities, and we've been able to create a space that is that safe.
Yeah.
And it doesn't start out that way. So it's not day one. It takes some time of me, you know, slowly building their capacity to have conversations in ways that are not judgmental and that do not cause harm.
Yeah. Well, even if you're like, I'm never going to integrate a social justice issue in my whole life, like never going to do it, you still need to create that safe space as a teacher. Like, even if you don't want to go into these issues, that's up to you, but like you still need to create that safe space, because your students, and I mean across the board, yes, but especially with the NGSS, your students have to be willing to take risk, and even just being wrong, like even if it's not a kind of scary or unpracticed conversation of, you know, who's not to blame, but like about the harm done, or like, again, those unpracticed conversations that are, I don't want to say the word difficult, but because I do like how when we shift our language, it shifts our perception of these things. But even if it's like, just, we did this lab and I have this idea, and it doesn't matter if I'm right or wrong, because it's just why the balls rolled down the ramp, but being wrong is still scary and is still like embarrassing and all that. So your students have to take those risks anyway. So you have to create that kind of safe space.
And we celebrate wrong. I tell my kids, like, yes, you got it wrong, yes. And they're like, yes, because this is the jumping board to finding the right answer. And I've convinced them that you learn more when you give an incorrect answer than when you give a correct one, right? Because you're creating new connections between the neurons. So again, that's part of that early tone you want to set, where students know, like, this is my best mistake. We have a wall that's like my best mistakes. Because I want them to know that's part of the process.
We need more of that. Like, I mean, I know all of that, like, yes, failure is good and we should fail, but still as an adult, I'm like, I don't want anyone to see me fail. I don't want anyone to see me say the wrong thing. And as much as, like, I mean, I try to kind of cultivate those attitudes, even in my own kids. My daughter is 4 and I can just tell she does not like being wrong, and she will do anything she can to like dodge admitting that she made a mistake or admitting that she was wrong, or like, it is kind of phenomenal watching the hoops she will go through to avoid like saying I made a mistake or I was wrong about this, or I mean, whatever it is. Even as much as I've like tried to like instill like, it's okay, we don't have to be right, or like she's afraid of being wrong, or like, and I don't know, I must be doing something wrong there, but
saying you right there, saying you did wrong, saying you're doing something wrong.
Yeah, I don't know, but I don't know, like, it's okay, let's just guess, like, it doesn't have to be right, like,
and we celebrate, we celebrate whatever, we celebrate that you came up with something, and then we fine tune it, we celebrate it, you know.
And that's what we
those messages are everywhere. The messages are everywhere, right? So it's like it's an active work for those messages. So you can
it's decolonize. This is part of our decolonization process. This idea that there's perfection, that there's one answer, that there's right, that there's this separation between the social and the emotional and the intellectual. Like that's all stuff we've learned, and it takes time and practice, you know?
Yeah.
So don't be so hard on yourself, Nicole.
No, you're right. You're nice. But I do need to see that I'm wrong more often, I think. Because my mom told me the other day, she's like, but Lila got so upset with her craft the other day because she says, Mommy does it perfect. And I'm like, I don't do anything perfect.
Perfection is a myth. There's not even such a
Like,
thing as perfect.
no.
Yeah.
But she has she's 4 and she has this idea that perfect is even like something
Yeah.
that you do. That
Because
some
we're
people
socialized.
are like,
It's
I would say it's in the air. It's
how
in
we're
the air.
socialized.
yeah. Okay, wait, let me see. I think we maybe got another comment. Oh, there's some articles shared, Little Miss Flint, and then 5 miles for a drink of water article, I guess, as
Okay.
some resources. I don't know if we have any other questions. I know we are at our 2:15, so we want to be wrapping up.
And then we're happy to share the, Nicole, I can send you the link to the
Okay.
Google Form, and we're happy to share.
Yeah.
People can access the cards if they want to.
Perfect. Yeah, I think we addressed all the questions that came up. And oh, I think someone said, Holly said, I think it's teachers need to make sure that we do like our inner work to be aware of our own biases, beliefs, all of that.
Absolutely.
So that was literally what our whole last.
I'm about to say we can end on that note because that is
Living number one.
ends
Living
with us.
number
Yeah,
one.
yeah. So for those of you who didn't catch when Salina and Alexis were with us last month, go back and watch that one. That was pretty much the gist of like that whole video that we did. So anyway. Oh, and they said they loved your My Best Mistakes board, and that, you know, students need to know that these are their biggest learning opportunities. So,
Yes.
yeah. All right. So, Salina and Alexis, thank you so much for coming back to our
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Thanks to all the
Thank
teachers
you.
for tuning in.
All right. And if any other questions pop up, Salina's part of the group too. Alexis, I think you're in